Are we live?
We are live.
Cool. Okay. Hello, anybody who happens to be watching right now, and welcome to a special issue of Facilitating XYZ Live. This can be very different from the other shows that we've done. We have a special topic we're going to be talking about, and we're doing it in a very different way. So I will let Mary Margaret introduce herself and what we're going to be doing.
Thanks, Sam. Hey, everybody. My name is Mary Margaret. I am a sexuality and healthy relationship facilitator. I'm living in Indianapolis, Indiana currently, and just started working with Facilitating XYZ here the last couple weeks. So I'm super excited to work with everybody. And one of our first topics that I'm going to be included on is the idea of self-disclosure during facilitation. This is something I think that I hear a lot of facilitators struggle with, or they're talking about it, but maybe not using that term self-disclosure. And so I guess I just kind of want to ask all of my buddies here, when you hear that phrase, what does that mean to you in the concept of like facilitating in that space? What does self-disclosure mean?
Yeah,
good question.
Good question.
I immediately think about the topic and how it affects how much I'm going to self-disclose. So Mary Margaret, hearing you talk about, sex ed, I've done some sex ed stuff in the past. I've done dating violence education, intimate partner violence education, facilitation. And I feel like I've been a lot more on guard about my self-disclosure during those types of topics than I am with something that's maybe a little bit less loaded. So I guess I'm not really answering your question, but that's the very first thing that comes into my mind is my willingness to do any type of disclosure depends on the topic that I'm facilitating, is the first kind of piece that I would be thinking through.
For me, I just in the simplest way, I would say it's any time that you share something personal with the group that you're facilitating. So anytime that you as the facilitator share something personal, like about your past, something you're interested in, an experience you've had, or even just a perspective that you might have, anytime you share something personal with the group, that would be how I would like really broadly characterize self-disclosure.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to Sam's list is like revealing, and maybe you mentioned this, but like the revealing an identity or naming an identity into the space. And I would say it's anything where like all of a sudden you become something like other than the role of like a facilitator, right? Like you've probably started with like, you could, I guess your name, right, would be a type of self-disclosure, especially if you like shared your full name and like, what you do and all of those things. Those are self-disclosures that I think a lot of us are comfortable with, or like that are par for the course. But there's other types of like revealing about self where you like that is a unique experience or a unique thing that you're sharing that like would be different than your co-facilitator and different than like anybody else that would be in that role. So that's the initial thoughts I've got to add.
Yeah, I like that idea of thinking about the type of facilitation, because I think that really does matter. And I, having background, like you were saying too, in the sexuality realm, right? And I don't know if this is for everyone who's ever done this, but I'm hearing you echo that too. I think particularly as someone who identifies as a woman in that space, I have often, I think, felt like what's the safety around doing that in this room? I think there are a lot of times where sex educators become sexualized because there's almost this like weird permission that since we talk about what we talk about, that like all of these questions are up for grabs, or that we're willing to disclose certain things or give our personal opinions or likes or dislikes because we're comfortable like going up and talking about sex, right? And so I think in those moments, it's really important for the safety of the facilitator to really weigh out like, where am I able to go with this? Professionally, personally, and kind of consider all those pieces. Consider if you have a partner. And again, that's very specific, I think, to like a sexuality or healthy relationship setting. But there's so many moving pieces to that of what's my comfort level, and ultimately safety, I think, comes into play. And I think identities make, like you said as well, can open up that door to like, is my safety in jeopardy at all by putting this out there?
Yeah. I think what you just kind of went into is why we originally threw this idea out there as like, let's talk about it in an article, and it was like, maybe let's talk about it for half an hour. Because, like, there's so many things, even just in like what you just got at, that this topic touches, and like why it's so loaded.
Yeah, for sure. How do you guys feel like you negotiate that? Is there a sort of a thought process of should I or shouldn't I? Does it happen in the moment? Are there certain workshops or trainings that you facilitate kind of over and over again where you have figured out like, this is what I say about myself during this one? How do you figure that out?
Mary Margaret, if it's okay, can we go back to one of the things that you said earlier? And it's interesting because I think all of us, the four of us have all done like gender or sexuality, like facilitation in some way. And that's something that we have as a shared experience. And I was just trying to think about someone who does a completely different type of facilitation. And when I've done sexuality education, you're totally right. Like that, because of the implications of the material, people will sexualize the facilitator. And I wonder if that is, I mean, it's definitely different because sexuality is held in such a different way than other whatever of ourselves and of thought. But if you were a person who is doing like an engineer, if you were facilitating an engineering group, or if you were a person who is facilitating like, I don't know, corporate team building, I wonder if in those settings, if you were to share something that was directly related to the material, if that would bring about risk in a similar way. Like if you're in an engineering, with an engineering group, and you mention something related to engineering, but you're not there as an engineer, you're there as a facilitator. If that would bring about some odd, some potentially like difficult challenge, like people would then be challenging you on that material, and it would be maybe harmful in different ways, like not risky in the same way that sexual disclosures could be risky. I don't know, it's just something that I was wondering if y'all, like what thoughts you have about that, like just the parallels, like sexuality education can be thought of as so extreme, but like the parallels in that disclosure.
Yeah. Go ahead, Kelly.
Oh, I was just going to say, I have a little bit of insight into this because I've been recently working with helping a couple of people in the organization I work in now do training, like first-time trainers, first-time facilitators, like they know a lot about a topic, but they've never done a training before. So I work in community health now, and one of my colleagues was just doing a training on applied statistics for healthcare, which is like tons of crazy, like, I see you guys nodding emphatically, like I had no clue what she was talking about. There's lots of like
strong word for
control charts and Excel and stuff that was like way over my head. And I gave her the same advice that I kind of give myself or when I was supervising other facilitators, which was like, disclose information when it serves the purpose of your training or facilitation. So she felt like she was worried that the audience wasn't going to take her seriously because she's a younger woman and there was a lot of men attending, there's a lot of CEOs attending, a lot of people in maybe more high power positions than she had held. And I just encouraged her to disclose her experiences working in that field where it served her, but also to not over disclose because she doesn't need to over explain herself because she knows the content and that she should trust in her knowing of that. So to me, that's a parallel between how I would think about it in a more like social justice facilitation or sex ed training or teen dating violence training in that way.
I think that's an awesome point. I mean, I think there's a lot of maybe validating that goes on, and that's a reason that people start sharing. I know I have felt that a lot, but I'm reminded, I guess, I'm trained as a social worker, and that idea of self-disclosure comes up a lot when you're training a therapist, right? So like, when does a therapist self-disclose? And the rule of thumb is always kind of like, well, if it helps the client, right? And oftentimes, if we really kind of drill down on it, we realize that it's more about us and not about the client. And that we're sharing for some reason, like we want to connect and we need something or some validation. And if that's the only reason, then like opt out of it. And so I'm wondering if that can kind of be helpful for other facilitators as well to kind of think about Do I need them to know this so we can move forward in some meaningful way? Or do I need them to know this because like I have some insecurity around being like a 5 foot tall woman who is like in my 30s but looks like I'm 16 and I'm like trying to right? And so like what is this serving here? And so I think that has always helped me to think through that motivation, I guess.
Yeah. The like word that came to mind is the legitimizing yourself, right?
Yeah.
That like sometimes I think that can be a dangerous type of self-disclosure of like, well, the reason you should trust me on this is because blank, blank, blank. And if you're doing that, again, like to put them at ease, like, hey, I have helped someone down a rock wall before. It is going to be okay. Being like, whoo, all right, good. It's not your first time. That's great.
Yeah.
Right. But if it's like, I know what I'm doing and here's the 5 ways I'm going to convince myself that it's okay for me to be here. Similar, thought process, but yeah.
You know, I'm getting some echoes, or maybe they're not echoes, but it's funny because the same exact self-disclosure could be completely self-involved and unhelpful or helpful. I was doing this training a couple days ago, and the person who was introducing me told the group that he just had a kid, which was completely unrelated to anything. Like there was no reason that was appropriate, but I was not bummed at all because everybody clapped for him and got really excited. And I was like, wow, that just served a really good purpose. Like this group just clapped, everybody just got happy. They have like this shared moment. And now when I come into this space, I'm not gonna have to create the first shared moment. So he didn't know he was doing that. I know that it wasn't intentional. He's very sweet and he was just excited about his kid. And nonetheless, it served a really good goal or a good outcome. It created a good outcome with the group. So it's just a funny thing that like, the same exact behavior could be one of 2 or any of those things we talked about.
I like that idea of a shared moment and creating that, like intentionally or not. In this case, obviously unintentionally, but I think that's often what we're striving for, right? I mean, especially at the very beginning, we definitely are, and to get that buy-in or some common ground or whatever it is. But that shared moment, I think, is super important. And this is, a really good, fast way sometimes to do that. But if it goes poorly, it can also like, no, and the wheels kind of come off like from the start, right? And it kind of makes, when I was thinking about this today, I was thinking about, I think, was it a Supreme Court case about like pornography when it was, the line was like, I know it when I see it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So this is kind of what I keep coming back to with this is like, well, how would I write an article and list out like, this is when you know it's appropriate. This is when you know it's helpful. And I struggled a lot because I think it really, for me, kept coming down to like, you just got to feel it out. What is your group telling you? I kind of know when it's appropriate or not. And that's hard to really drill down and write down in any kind of like how-to guide, because I think it changes with every group and every setting and geographically and all of that. And it really is something I think you get better at as a facilitator. I mean, I think back like 10 years ago and things that I probably told a group of students, like probably wouldn't say now for different, for various reasons. But I think you start feeling it out and knowing what this crowd is going to be responding to, what they're going to think you're just like a total nerd if you share, and they're just going to kind of like write you off, right? So I think you kind of start feeling that out, and it's an experience thing. Maybe, I don't know, maybe you disagree.
I'm wondering that what your comment was kind of made me think of another question for all of us, which is, how do you, like, what are some of those factors that you take into account when you decide whether or not to self-disclose? So for example, I'm thinking, or what things you are going to self-disclose. So I'm thinking about maybe the age of my group, maybe the number of times I've been with them. Is it like a one-time training and I've only met them once, or have I been with them for half of a school year or something like that? What are some other things that you guys would think of that might help you make some of those decisions?
I think of my, this kind of tied into another conversation, but in co-facilitation, like then all of a sudden it becomes not just about my comfort level, but like the comfort level and perceived pressure, like that the person I'm working with of like, hey, if I share this about myself, are they going to feel like oh, I have to share now. So that's something that I know that, you know, me and Sam and other people that I've worked with have like actively navigated of how is my co-facilitator feeling about whatever other factors we're about to go into, but the co-facilitation is definitely one of them. Yeah.
I think of time a lot. So I think that self-disclosure, and Mary Margaret, you mentioned this earlier, like it can be a really quick way to achieve a certain outcome. It can be powerful, it can be immediate. I love playing video games, and I can maybe think of self-disclosure as like the special weapon that you only get to use a few times every level, but you only have a few, and it does like something really big. So if you need to jam, if you're surrounded, maybe use that and like wipe the slate clean and move on to the next activity or move on to the next part of your training, whatever it might be. Or if you can tell the group's really getting hung up on something, and you've got something from like something you can disclose that will help them work through that, it can be really helpful. But I also feel like if you've got time, allowing the group to get to whatever they would get from your self-disclosure on their own is probably going to be more powerful for them as a group. So if whatever that outcome would be, if you can find a way to move them towards that outcome through other tactics of facilitation instead of disclosing, it's probably going to be better for them in the long run.
Can you think of an example of that, Sam?
So example of what? Like the last thing I just said?
Yeah, of like when you could have been like, here's the thing, moving on, versus like letting the group get to their own process.
Yeah, I mean, like I could just make one up off the top of my head. I can think of real ones. So imagine like you did something in the past that was a mistake. So maybe the process of the facilitation is somehow related to helping the group understand like the pain of some sort of a decision that might be made in the group. And you've made that mistake personally, and it had some like big ramifications for you. You could share that yourself and be like, oh, you know, in the past I made this mistake, I did this thing. So in like maybe if you're doing STI prevention education, you talk about like a time that you had like a issue with a barrier, you chose not to use one, a barrier broke, something like that. Like you can share a story that would be like, oh wow, like that's really real, and you can bring the emotion into it. And you could do that through self-disclosure, or you could try to create an opportunity for members in the group to reflect on times when they've made similar mistakes, or when they've made decisions that they weren't proud of, how that felt, how they'd like to be able to like prepare for a decision in the future, what might go into that preparation, which would probably take 5 to 10 minutes. And that quick little anecdote might only take 30 seconds. Does that make sense, Meg?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it's just such a big, like, I don't know. I think there's some times where I'm like, oh, that sounds really good, I want to do that. But like thinking of how does it actually play out? I think so much of facilitation kind of learning is like that, right? Of like, that sounds good. How do I do that? Like, or what does that mean in the moment? So yeah, that was why I was like, because tangible examples, I think, help just cement the bigger concept. So.
You know, something I was kind of thinking about during all of that is in my current work, so my sort of like full-time gig is working with a domestic violence agency, and we do advocacy and education in the community. And so we often are approached by survivors of domestic violence who want to share their story, right? And so they know that we are often in the community and we need speakers, and we have an annual gala they can maybe come speak to. And part of my job is to vet those people, and which is weird, right? Because I'm sort of vetting like, this is your personal story, and like I'm gonna make a call whether or not it's like worthy of my event or something weird. But I think I thought about it that way for a long time, but I think what actually my job is to facilitate that facilitator is to really, figure out, is this person in a place where they are comfortable actually, right? Like being in front of a group of 300 people and sharing a story for the first time. Like, is this the best venue to self-disclose for the first time when there's like 300 strangers there? I don't know. And kind of having coffee with them and saying like, here's what this event's like. Does that feel right to you? And I think when the event is about self-disclosure, right? So someone's coming to hear someone's experience. And this is really common right now in the refugee community I work with, right? People want to hear, like, what was it like to flee, right? Like, we want to know and paint this picture. So the whole point of it is self-disclosure. It's all storytelling. And so I guess, Sam, I'm thinking a little bit about your work just because I'm more familiar with it, and your work around is pronounced metrosexual, and like sharing your story about how did I start studying gender and all of that stuff. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on if the point of the facilitation might be to like tell a specific story or to share a certain part of yourself, and what kind of boundaries can you build around that with your audience so you feel authentic and feel like you're sharing, but also protecting your story enough to say, like, I am going to tell you that this was something I struggled with or lived through or whatever the case may be. And also, like, that doesn't mean you get to like ask me super personal questions I haven't disclosed, or like, do you know what I'm saying? Those boundaries around it, I think, get tricky the more that you are willing to give.
Yeah, and you just said something I think might be like a really good concrete rule when it comes to disclosure, which is if you're going to disclose something, maybe a good like 100% of the time rule is to not disclose it in front of a group that you're facilitating for the first time. Like if you've never disclosed something to somebody else, like don't try something out with your group. And maybe especially, or in parentheses, if it's something like deeply emotional or traumatic, like don't try that with a group first. Make sure that you've done it in other settings for your own sake. But getting back to so remember, I think that question brings about like this other idea in my head, which is like very mixed modal type experiences. So in experiences where I'd be telling stories, I wouldn't consider myself to be a facilitator. I might switch into like put on my facilitator cap or switch into facilitator mode. But I'm serving a much different purpose than I am when I go into a setting just to be a facilitator. Do you all agree like that there would be like big differences if you're going to like share some stories or tell about your experience working at this agency, and then maybe after that you're doing some facilitation? It feels different than if you're just doing a training.
I think of it as like the panelist versus the moderator. Like the moderator is the facilitator, right? Like they're the ones eliciting the things, which is why it's weird sometimes when the moderator starts sharing and you're like, whoa, they're the panelists, right? So like, yeah, like, are you the panelist in the moment or are you the moderator? And I think like the moderator is the facilitator role and the panelists are lecturers, like, or storytellers, if we don't feel the word lecturer is a nice word for people. So yeah, I would say that's the first separation came to mind. And I think you have like different responsibilities and different thought processes around self-disclosure, around your role in the space. Like all those things change because of your role with the group and the event.
Yeah, I agree with that.
For sure. Yeah. Does anyone have like a story of self-disclosure that like went really, really badly or really, really well that you would, not mind disclosing right now?
This is so meta. Yeah, just like, are we asking for self-disclosure? Wait, am I the panelist or am I the moderator?
I don't know. Who am I?
What's happening?
No, I'm thinking of a training that I've done many times that I definitely do use some self-disclosure. Although through our conversation, I'm thinking like, oh, if I have the time, should I just like hold that and let them do it? So now I'm like second guessing it. But I can share the example where I think it does typically go well. Excuse me. I do a training based on my favorite book of all time that Meg and Sam have heard me talk about like a million times, called Trauma Stewardship, which is a way of thinking about caring for yourself so you can better care for others. And so there's an activity that I do like a gallery walk activity with the different signs of trauma exposure response that folks can have. And I like to share with people that when I first read this book, I thought I totally had like everything under control. Like I didn't feel traumatized. I thought I was good. But as I read the book, I realized that because of the different ways that trauma exposure can show up, that I definitely was experiencing some of that, and that's why I felt like this training is so valuable. This is why I'm so passionate about it, and that's why I'm here to share it with you today. So I feel like that really gets people on board, because a lot of times with that particular training, I found that people are kind of like resistant to the idea that they could be experiencing trauma exposure response, and that like there's something they're experiencing it, or that they should, you know, be ashamed of it, or something, like, you know, some of those reactions. So I think my goal with sharing that is saying like, hey, look, like we're all in this together, and I'm here to help you with that, because I know how difficult it can be. So that's an example of a time when I feel like it's gone well, when I've done that several different times with that topic.
One thing you made me just think of there, Kaylee, was the idea of self-disclosure as a way to opt into the group's experience, or a way to like to relate into the group's experience of like, hey, I'm not this person who's way up here, who's trying to like teach you these things way down here. Like, I want you to let you know, like, I have I have a little bit more experience talking about them, or like a little more practice, but like I too benefit from this conversation, or like I have an investment, like a personal investment in it. I don't know. I think there's some interesting kind of relating in that we're trying to do sometimes when we share those things.
The non-expert aspect of it, we talk about sometimes.
Yeah.
So has anyone ever had anybody, and my guess is the answer is going to be a resounding yes. Has anyone been asked by someone in your facilitation to disclose something, like asked a really personal question and answer time? Everyone's like yes. And and how do you handle that? And have you made a misstep and maybe thought like, I should have answered that, or I should not have answered that, and I did? And how do you kind of respond to that ask? And I guess I'll say the reason that I'm saying that is because my struggle with that is I feel like that question comes from a place that like they need something from me. And that's the way they're asking for it. Maybe there's another way I can get it to them. But we're relating, and that's how it comes up is, have you ever, or, however they ask it. But any thoughts from the crowd on those experiences?
Yes, I mean, I feel like I don't mean to be the first one answering your questions, but I'm like, yes, oh my gosh. So just teaching healthy relationships and dating violence, I've been asked, are you married? Are you in a relationship? Do you have kids? Have you been abused? Do you know someone who's been abused? Like those types of questions. And usually this is from teens, which is where I did the most of that facilitation. And I definitely think there were times where I stumbled over my response, because I think instinctually, I'm also a person that like keeps a lot of things close to my chest in my life in general. So I think that makes me even more hesitant to do self-disclosure as a facilitator. That's just my personality. So I'm more apt to find a way around a self-disclosure as opposed to, be more willing to do it. So, sometimes I've said, well, why are you asking me that? It's kind of a standard one that I think, I've taught other people to do too. Yeah. And sometimes things like, do you know anybody who's been in an abusive relationship? Like I've answered that one honestly and said, yeah. And, I think, and then turn the question back around. It's a short answer like, yes, I have. And with the statistics that we know about abusive relationships, it's very likely that probably one of you guys do too. That's why we need to be sensitive to this topic, So I do a lot of like answer and pivots, like a quick, like I'm not going into the whole story about that person that I know. Sometimes I've even just flat out said, you're like, you know what, like whether or not I'm in a relationship isn't actually that important to our conversation today, because we all deserve healthy relationships. And there's a chance that we're all going to be in a relationship someday. So let's talk about this have this conversation now, so like it's the answer and pivot, or the don't answer and pivot kind of response.
Yeah.
One thing you said, Kaylee, that I thought was interesting as well was the like, hey, I'm not a super open book type of person. So like, I'm going to look for more creative ways to answer that question versus like, I am a really open book kind of person. And so self-disclosure, like other than like, hopefully the ideas of like, is it going to harm or take away from my group? Although I've definitely done it when it has. And like, is this just for my own sake? But like beyond those things, like I'm pretty happy and like, yeah, open to talking about it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that can make me, I think, too likely to self-disclose and not the like, man, this would have been really helpful if I felt comfortable, but I'm not going to, versus like sometimes I do and then I walk away being like, that was completely unnecessary. And now
they know my whole life story now.
I feel like, known me or even been my Facebook friend for like 5 seconds, you know that I like don't.
Hey, Mary Margaret.
Yeah, Mary Margaret. I can't
hear you.
Yep.
I think you might be covering your microphone or the speaker on your computer.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Weird. Just put my hands in there for the rest of the call. What do I do with my hands? I really related to that. I mean, if you've known me for like 5 seconds, I think most people would say that I'm pretty open about most things, and I kind of wield that, I think, sometimes like in like weird political ways, like just things I feel like that we should be talking about more as a culture that we don't, and like I kind of make it a point to like talk about those things really publicly, just because I think we should, and it's helpful. And I hate the word should, I guess, but you know what I mean? That if you're willing and able, like that we should be having more conversations about, you know, whatever people struggle with mental illness or, you know what I mean? Like whatever the things are that we should be talking about more. And so I purposefully in my own life, like try to do a little bit of that. And so Meg, I think I also kind of struggle with, is this helpful, or is this just my, you know, my thing is that I kind of maybe overshare, or like I'm an only child and think I'm super important, right? Like, you know, how much of that is helpful and like how much of it is like, you know, because I think it can be, I think it can create really, really wonderful moments. And even just in my own life, I've seen evidence of that. And I think it kind of makes me think like, wow, what if I brought that experience into a room? How would that start like a relationship, I guess? If I, you know, if we're talking about like a relational experience, sometimes in a facilitation, with sharing my experience was something that's like kind of difficult for people to get their head around or talk about, could that be a helpful place to start? And I think sometimes it has been for me. And I also have had times where I've said something and everyone's kind of like, you know, like, what? Okay, that was too much. That was too much, right? So, yeah, it's hard.
You know what, Mary Margaret and Meg, what y'all are talking about is funny, because when I said that self-disclosure can be like a really quick way to an outcome, it can also be like a big old waste of time, right? Like sometimes the facilitator will start to self-disclose and 8 minutes later, they're still talking and the group's like, what are we even doing here? So it can be completely opposite. I forgot, it's double-edged in that way. But the other thing that popped into my mind was another rule, which is to prepare before the training what types of self-disclosures you are planning or you're willing to do. So like, what types of questions are you willing to answer that are related to self-disclosure? What anecdotes do you want to have like in mind? And if you prepare those beforehand, like if you're not saying it for the first time, that's the other rule. And if you prepare them beforehand, odds are they're not going to take away from learning outcomes, or you're not going to like regret saying it afterwards. I often go into trainings and go in educational settings, like little anecdotes that I have in mind. If I hit a particular friction point, I'm like, oh, this anecdote is 1.5 minutes and it really does a good job of like unraveling that. And I have anecdotes that aren't related. And even if someone asks a question like, oh, this would be a great time to tell that funny story, I resist because I don't think it's related. Unless I have like a full day, in which case, of course, we're going to do the funny story. So going, and maybe that's like, if you have a supervisor, maybe that's asking your supervisor, like, what am I allowed to answer? Or if you're in a co-facilitator relationship, asking your co-facilitator, what are you comfortable answering? Because I don't want to answer anything that's going to put you on the spot to answer something. And if you're just going in by yourself and you're the only one making the rules, maybe it's like, what am I comfortable with? What will help the group? And what will make the most sense, like, beforehand going in. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm trying to come up with less the porn when you see it. The subtitle of this video.
Yeah.
Like questions to ask yourself. Like I'm thinking about our like co-facilitator checklist. I'm almost feeling like we should have a self-disclosure checklist or a pre-facilitation checklist where we think of, you can go through the list and check off some things. Because I just recently used the co-facilitator checklist with a new colleague of mine, and we talked about that question. It was super, super helpful. The training's next Friday, though, so I'll report back on how it goes.
The other one that comes to mind, which I've, taken from Brene Brown, like most of the good things in my life, which is like, you can share something that you had shame around, but you cannot share it unless you've worked through the shame.
Yup.
Right. So
work through your ish first. Yes.
Your ish. That's the bullet on the checklist. Yeah. I think that don't say it for the first time unless it's like, oh my God, I too grew up in, Oklahoma. I didn't know anybody else was here. Right. Like I've never shared that with random people I'm working with. Right. Inappropriate. But don't share something for the first time, and don't share something that you are actively working through or not actively working through, and haven't kind of completed the journey of and I feel okay about sharing this story now. This story doesn't hold power over me. I can share, I did this crappy thing once and that was a really hard learning experience. But it's okay. And I'm still a good person. If you can't answer that confidently with I'm still a good person, then don't share it. That's, I think, something, when I have done that, no good has come from those moments, or it only good has happened serendipitously. That was not going to be as a result of that moment, because it's too live in my body to have me be fully present, which to me is can you disclose this and be fully present would maybe be another item. If it's not going to take you, if it's not too funny and you just go back to that memory, or too traumatic that you go back to that place of feeling those things, you should be able to remain fully present while telling the story or sharing the thing.
That, the way that you worded that, and I know you were saying it in a way of asking myself this, but it kind of also made me think about, for me, a helpful way, kind of setting the tone, especially for participants asking for more from you and more self-disclosure from you, is really starting the time together by kind of laying, and I hate saying rules, right? But setting expectations around where you're willing to go. And that can be done, I think, without making it feel like rules and you and me and we can't, right? But I mean, especially when I was working with middle schoolers and high schoolers, I started every time together with, I'm not going to ask you personal questions, and you're not going to ask me personal questions. And that's just sort of a rule that we have between each other to keep everybody's privacy safe. Is that cool? And I think showing them the buy-in for them too, oh, she's not going to put me on the spot either. Awesome. And then if it comes up, it's an easy thing to refer back to, well, you know what? Remember how we kind of set this space up with the expectation that we could just talk about the issues and not ourselves. I really want to stick to that because I think it's helpful. And I think if you set that up from the beginning, it's just easy to fall back on, right? And if you haven't, and if you've already maybe self-disclosed more than you wanted, it's really hard to pull back from there. And so I think, all these things that we're talking about, asking ourselves beforehand, are so important. And then establishing that with the group and saying here's kind of our group norms. Are we all good with that, right? And keep and honor those as you keep moving forward.
I have another rule that just popped it into my mind. If you self-disclose, your participants are going to self-disclose, right? We just know that. If we model something, even if we have modeled something harmful, other people are going to follow that, right? If you've ever made an inappropriate joke by accident, I'm oh, shit, now everybody's going to be making...
Yeah, because you're role modeling the whole time.
Yeah. So only self-disclose in trainings in which self-disclosure for the participants is important to the learning outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I don't think you have to self-disclose to get them to self-disclose.
No, you sure don't.
Yep. Yeah, you usually don't.
You're gonna do it no matter what. No.
Yep. But there's no rule.
I like it. Are we writing these down? No.
Yeah, Sam, I really love the words you used about if you are, how did you say it? You said something like, even if you're doing it in a harmful way, like even if you're causing harm, like they're going to mirror that. And I loved that because it's unfortunate. It's so true though, right? Is that you are all of a sudden, it's like the experiments with like, you put someone in a white coat and automatically like we give them all of this authority as like the doctor, right? Like, it's kind of the same thing. If we stand in front of a room or like our name's on a program or something, like whether or not we deserve it, we are coming in with some kind of like expertise attached to us and power. And so, yeah, if you're modeling something harmful, you're bringing everybody with you, right? In some way. I'm really glad that you pointed that out because I see it happening actually kind of frequently when I attend things. And I don't know that everyone's like aware that that's happening, but you just start following the lead. This is the environment we're in now. Oh, okay. Especially if it's a challenging topic, we're all looking for cues. Like, how do we deal with it? How do we take care of each other? The person on stage is doing this. I guess I'll do that.
I also would say, like, even a more nuanced way, if you self-disclose for 5 minutes, you've also set that precedent, right? If you say like, totally. Yeah, I can totally relate to that. Boom, right? And then you like go in a different direction. That is the level of like joining in that people are going to go. But if you're like, oh, I relate to that, just like this one time, and you go into a 5-minute story, you have set that norm. And so like rule would be like, do not set a norm of self-disclosure that is longer than you would be okay with anybody else doing, because that is, you are the norm, you are norm setting all the time. So this one I feel will be very important for me moving forward. I feel Sam's approval of this rule already. So
we're going to training in like 2 weeks. So we'll see. We'll report back.
Yep. Don't disclose longer than you are willing to hear somebody else disclose for. Unless it's like a set, like I'm going to tell you this story, but you really have to do that. You have to put a container around that where people know it's a different thing. Like, oh, this is a mini lecture versus like, this is a self-disclosure, right? Like you got to put a container and a bow around it and be like, no, you can't do that because this was a different thing. If you anecdote it, it's different. You're setting a precedent.
Totally. Yeah, I love that.
Whew. I never thought of that.
We're learning so much today.
Yeah.
And you know, the last thing, I think I was pushing back, right, internally. I'm pushing back against this idea that like you can't know it until you do it, because so much of what we're trying to do with Facilitating XYZ is to provide the learning for people that can have it not at their own expense or at the participant's expense. Yeah. But I will say that the one thing that keeps coming to my mind is the idea of the Dunning-Kruger effect, or just the idea that you can't necessarily know you're bad at something until you get pretty good at it. So I would say another self-disclosure rule would be to like run your self-disclosures by somebody who you respect, like another facilitator, somebody in your field, somebody in your workplace. Be like, hey, I keep telling this story. Do you think this is really necessary and helpful? If it's one of those, maybe that's okay. If it's neither, I need to stop doing it, because even in reflecting, you might be like, that story just is fire and I need that story, and not be able to tell that it's not helpful, right? So another self-disclosure rule is maybe check with a peer or check with someone you respect about your self-disclosures and see if they agree that they're helpful, and maybe let that inform your decision.
Yeah.
So that's giving me permission to call all of you guys, right, and tell you like really crazy stories about myself. Like,
yeah,
okay. How'd that make you feel? Was it weird?
I think it was the word invasive, because I think if you're putting the word invasive before it, that would be another rule. Like if you feel it is an invasive story, or just an adjective that you wouldn't want attached to it. Generally speaking,
how are you talking about your story? Yeah.
Is that what you thought this little round table was going to be? It was just you self-disclosing a lot of things, just like to vent it out.
And that's telling you like thumbs up, thumbs down.
Yeah.
That's what YouTube is. I think that's what YouTube.
That is YouTube. YouTube is self-disclosure as a social network.
I'm thinking of that clip of did you guys were you 30 Rock fans when the show was on?
Yes.
When Liz Lemon's on the plane with Oprah and just like, you know, like one time at summer camp I kissed a girl, and then like, and Oprah's just, and you know, staring at her, and that's that's what I'm thinking. And now that I think more about that, I think I have been in workshops and trainings that like kind of felt that way. You know, I kind of felt like Oprah sitting in the seat being facilitated to, right? Like,
we can link
Why
to
are
that
you
clip.
telling me this?
We can link
Rule
to that
number
clip and
6.
say,
Your participants are not Oprah.
Yep.
If at any moment your participants feel like Oprah and you're disclosing things to only them, you're doing it wrong.
That's the rule. That's the number one rule. Don't let your participants feel like Oprah.
Yes.
awesome. This has been a great chat, everyone.
Yeah.
I love when I learn things,
Yes.
yeah, live and in time.
definitely. Does anyone have any sort of like little like shots of wisdom, like little things that you just feel like you really want to say about self-disclosure, that you're thinking about the shower earlier today, knowing this conversation was coming up, that you like really needed to get out there?
It's important. You should take it seriously, whatever I think you should take it seriously. I think people shouldn't treat it lightly. And like we've talked for 45 minutes and I think we could go another 45. So I think that's what I would say is like a general rule of self-disclosure is like it can have a big impact in both directions, and be very conscious of when you're making that choice that it's only going to go in that positive space and that you're not taking away from the environment, because it can have big negative impacts.
Love it. I think I will, one thing that kept coming through my mind, Meg, is you shared earlier about Brene Brown being kind of in your head with this. And I believe it was in her book, Daring Greatly, that she said, or maybe it was in her TED Talk, but she talks about not everyone deserves to hear your story either. That like just because it's like available, that like it's a trust thing, that we build trust with people, right? And that people can't ask whatever they wish of us just because they know like it's available. And that I think, Kaylee, you talked a little bit about working with teens, about relationships and stuff, and those, yes, all of those questions like every single time, right?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times I kind of weighed that moment of would it be helpful or not, but also like, do I have enough trust? Do I feel safe sharing this? And like, has this group, like, have we earned each other's trust to share our stories? Have I earned their trust to ask them to share if they want to, and kind of vice versa. And so I think that kind of gives us permission, if we feel kind of pressed maybe to share more, to really give ourselves permission that we don't have to, like, we're in charge of our own stories, and the narrative is ours to construct. And I think Brene really summed that up, in that we get to decide that, you know?
Yeah, I don't think you need to self-disclose at all to be an amazing facilitator. And I think that if you are a person who chooses to self-disclose with following the 6 rules or whatever they've been laid out so far, with what Meg said, doing so really intentionally is important. And thinking about your participants and yourself, right? Like all the people involved.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't have to self-disclose. I don't know if that was like or if we should say that, but I guess that's the thing to say. You don't have to self-disclose to be a good
Yeah, I think we should say that.
Right. Yeah.
All
We're
right.
all smiling.
I think you all said it all. I don't have anything else to add. I talked enough, I think.
Well, thanks y'all for the chat.
Yeah.
Stay here. I'm gonna press off right now. So bye, anybody watching.